The morning I almost lost everything began the way most dangerous mornings do, quietly, with someone smiling at me across a kitchen counter. It was Thanksgiving, and my son had set the table the way I used to when he was a boy. The good china, the cloth napkins his father had picked out 30 years ago, the little ceramic pilgrims I kept in a box in the hall closet that only came out once a year. He had driven 4 hours from Atlanta to do this, and when I walked downstairs to find him standing at my stove, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt taken care of. "Sit down, Mom," he said. "I've got everything handled." I was 63 years old. I had spent 31 of those years as a registered nurse, most of them in a cardiac unit where I learned to read people the way some women read novels, quickly, carefully, always watching for the detail that changes everything. I had raised 2 children mostly alone after my husband Dennis passed from a stroke when the kids were still in middle school. I had managed a mortgage, a retirement account, 2 college tuitions, and a body that had started asking questions my doctors couldn't always answer. I was not a fragile woman. I was not a woman who needed to be handled. But that morning, watching my son move through my kitchen with such easy confidence, I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wanted to believe the instinct pulling at the back of my neck was just exhaustion, or grief, or the particular loneliness that comes from living alone in a house that used to hold 4 people. I sat down at my own kitchen table and watched my son make me breakfast. His name is Michael. He had just turned 41 in September, and he had his father's jaw and his father's way of standing with one hand on his hip when he was thinking. His wife, Renata, was still upstairs. I could hear her moving around, the particular creak of the floorboards in the guest room that I had memorized over 22 years in that house. My daughter Patricia was driving up from Savannah and wouldn't arrive until noon, which meant Michael and I had the whole morning together, which he had apparently planned for. "I made you something," he said, and turned from the counter holding a tall glass of something pale green and thick. "Renata's been on this whole nutrition thing. It's got spinach, banana, almond milk. She swears by it." He said it in front of me. I looked at the glass. I don't know exactly what it was, 30 years of reading patients. Maybe, or something older and more animal than that. But something in the way he set it down, just slightly too carefully. The way you set something down when you're thinking about it too hard, something made me pause. "You made one for yourself?" I asked. He laughed. "I'm more of a coffee guy, you know that. Make yourself one," I said. "I don't want to drink alone." He hesitated. It was brief, barely a second, and he covered it well with another laugh and a turn back toward the counter. "Mom, it's just a smoothie." "I know," I said. "I just think it would be nice." He made another one. I watched him the entire time. We sat across from each other, and I lifted the glass and pretended to drink, tipping it just enough to wet my upper lip. And then I set it down and said I wanted to wait for my eggs. He nodded and went back to the stove. I looked at the glass for a long moment, and then I made a decision I had been avoiding for almost 4 months. I decided to stop pretending I didn't know what was happening. It had started in July, which I know now was not actually when it started, only when I finally started paying attention. Michael had called to say he and Renata were thinking about moving back to the Southeast, maybe somewhere closer to me, and wasn't that wonderful news? I said it was. He asked how I was managing the house on my own. I said fine. He said he'd been thinking, and he knew a financial advisor, a friend of a friend, who specialized in estate planning for people in my situation. "What situation?" I asked. "Retirement," he said quickly. "People who want to make sure everything is protected." I had been a nurse, not an accountant, but Dennis had always been careful with money, and careful people tend to marry people who pay attention. I had a house paid off, a pension, a 401 key I had contributed to for 3 decades, and a life insurance policy that Dennis had set up when the children were small. I was comfortable, not wealthy, but comfortable, and I had never given my children reason to worry about any of it. I met the financial advisor in August. His name was Todd, and he had very clean shoes and a habit of saying, "At your stage of life," every 3 or 4 sentences. Michael sat beside me the entire meeting, and I noticed that he and Todd had a way of finishing each other's sentences that people only do when they've had a conversation before. Todd suggested a trust. He suggested transferring certain assets into it now, to avoid probate, to protect me, to simplify everything for my family when the time came. When the time came, I repeated. Todd smiled. "It's just planning, Carol. Everybody does it." I told him I wanted to think about it. Michael walked me to my car afterward and squeezed my shoulder and said, "Todd was one of the best in the business, and there was no rush, but these things did take time to set up properly, and he just wanted to make sure I was taken care of." There it was again. Taken care of. I drove home and called Patricia. My daughter is 38 and teaches high school English in Savannah and has her father's instinct for when something is wrong. I told her about the meeting. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, did Michael tell you about the loan?" I did not know about any loan. She told me carefully, the way she tells her students difficult things, that Michael had mentioned to her in passing as though it were nothing, as though she already knew that I had lent him $40,000 in the spring to help cover a shortfall at the small business he and Renata ran together. An event planning company that had been struggling since before the pandemic and had apparently never fully recovered. I had done no such thing. I sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time after I hung up with Patricia. Then I went inside and pulled out my bank statements for the previous 6 months and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where my son had just set a smoothie in front of me, and went through every line. I found 3 transfers. The first was in February, $12,000, moved from my savings to a joint checking account I had opened with Michael years ago when he was in college, and I had needed a way to send him money quickly. I had forgotten that account still existed. The second was in April, $15,000. The third was in May, $14,000. $41,000 total, moved in 3 installments, each one on a weekday morning when I would have been at my water aerobics class. I sat with that information for a week before I did anything with it. I want you to understand something about that week, because I think people who haven't lived it don't always understand the particular paralysis of discovering that your child has stolen from you. It is not like discovering that a stranger has stolen from you. A stranger takes something, and you are angry, and you act. Your child takes something, and you sit with a week's worth of questions that have no good answers. You think about the night you stayed up until 3 a.m. with a fever of 104, changing the sheets, refilling the humidifier, reading picture books in a hoarse voice, until he fell back asleep. You think about the graduation, and the wedding, and all the times you wrote a check because you wanted to, because that's what mothers do, because the money was always less important to you than the look on his face when the problem went away. And then you think, he knew that. He was counting on it. That was the thought that got me out of the paralysis. I called Patricia back and told her everything. She drove up the following weekend, and we sat at the kitchen table together, with the statements spread between us, and she held my hand, and we talked about what to do. She wanted to confront him immediately. I said no. I needed to understand the full picture before I said a word, because once you say the word, you can't unsay it. And I had spent 31 years learning that you treat the whole patient, not just the symptom in front of you. I called an attorney named Frances, who had been recommended by a woman in my book club whose own estate had been contested after her husband died. Frances was in her late 50s, direct in the way that women who have been underestimated for decades tend to be direct. And she listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Carol, What you're describing is financial elder abuse. It is a crime in this state. And I want you to understand that before we go any further, because I want you to know what your options actually are. Nobody had called it that before. Elder abuse. I turned the words over in my mind the way you turn over a stone, looking at the underside. Frances told me to change the password on every account Michael had any access to, including the joint account. She told me to contact my bank directly and flag the previous transfers. She told me not to sign anything, no matter what it was, no matter how routine it seemed, without her reviewing it first. And she told me to start documenting everything, every conversation, every visit, every request with dates and as much detail as I could remember. I started that day. By the time Thanksgiving came, I had a notebook with 63 entries. I had changed my passwords. I had spoken with my bank, which had opened an internal review. I had updated my will with Frances present, removing the provision that had named Michael as the sole executor of my estate and replacing it with a co-executor arrangement that included Patricia and a professional trustee Frances recommended. I had done all of this quietly, calmly, without a single word to Michael, because 31 years of nursing had taught me that you don't let the patient know you've identified the problem until you're ready to treat it. And then my son came to Thanksgiving and made me a smoothie, and something shifted. After breakfast, which I ate, and which was genuinely good, because whatever else he was, Michael had always been a better cook than me, Renata came downstairs. She was warm in the way she was always warm with me, attentive, touching my arm when she talked, asking about my knee and my book club and the neighbor's dog I sometimes walked. I had always liked Renata. That made it harder. Michael suggested we take a walk before Patricia arrived. Just the two of us, the way we used to on holidays when the kids were small and the house got too full of noise and we would slip out the back door and walk around the block. And he would tell me things he didn't say in front of anyone else. I said yes. I put on my coat. We walked. He waited until we were half a block from the house. "Mom," he said, "I want to talk to you about something." "Okay," I said. "I've been thinking a lot about your situation. The house, the finances, all of it. You're managing it all alone, and it's a lot. And I want to make sure you're protected." There was that word again. He told me he'd been talking to Todd again. He said Todd had drawn up some papers just preliminary, nothing formal yet that would create a structure where, if anything ever happened to me, if I ever got sick or had an accident or just needed help, there would be someone with the legal authority to step in and manage things. Someone who knew me, who loved me, who would always act in my best interest. "Are you talking about power of attorney?" I asked. "Broadly, yes. And some asset restructuring. It would all be in your name, of course." "Of course," I said. I kept walking. I kept my face neutral. I was thinking about a patient I'd had once, years ago. A man named Raymond, who had come in with chest pain that turned out to be nothing cardiac at all, but who had sat in the bed with such a particular kind of stillness, the stillness of a man who had decided something, and it had taken me 2 days to understand that what he'd decided was that there was no point in fighting anymore. I had sat with Raymond for an hour one afternoon, and I had told him, gently but without softness, that giving up was also a choice, and that choices have consequences, and he had looked at me for a long time, and then started to cry. I thought about Raymond, and I kept walking next to my son. "When would you need me to look at these papers?" I asked. "Soon," he said. "Before the end of the year, ideally. Tax reasons." "Send them to my attorney first," I said. "Frances, you have her contact information." He paused. "You have an attorney?" "I've had an attorney for years, Michael, since your father died." That wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. And I watched him process the information the way I watched patients process difficult diagnoses. First, the brief failure of the face, then the reconstruction, then the revised response. "Of course," he said. That's a good idea. We walked back to the house. Patricia arrived at noon in her old blue Subaru with a pecan pie and a bottle of wine, and the particular energy she always carried, which was the energy of someone who knows exactly how much space she's allowed to take up in a room and takes all of it. She hugged me for a long time in the doorway, and I felt her assess me the way only sisters and daughters can quickly, completely, in the space of a breath. We had Thanksgiving dinner, and it was, on the surface, a normal Thanksgiving. The turkey was good. The stuffing was from my mother's recipe. Renata had made a cranberry sauce with orange zest that was genuinely excellent, and I told her so. And she beamed, and I felt the complicated grief of caring about someone who has helped to hurt you. After dinner, while Michael and Renata were doing dishes and Patricia and I sat at the kitchen table with our wine, my daughter reached into her bag and put a small digital recorder on the table between us. I put it in the centerpiece during dinner, she said quietly. I looked at it. Patricia, I know, she said. But Francis said documentation. I picked up the recorder. I pressed play. The dinner conversation came out of the small speaker, tinny and close, and we listened to our own family talking about nothing. The drive from Atlanta, the traffic on I-85, the neighbor's new addition. A movie Michael and Renata had seen last week, and then, at a point where Patricia had gone to the kitchen to check on the pie, Michael's voice dropped, and he said to Renata, barely audible beneath the noise of silverware, "We need to move faster." And Renata said, "How much faster?" And Michael said, "Before Christmas." Patricia and I sat in silence for a moment. Outside, we could hear the water running in the kitchen, Michael's low voice, Renata's laugh at something. "Okay," I said finally. "Okay," Patricia said. "I'm ready." I called Frances the following Monday and told her everything, including the smoothie I hadn't drunk, and the conversation I had, and the recording Patricia had made. Frances was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Carol, I need you to come in this week. There are some additional steps I want to take before your son makes his next move." I went in on Wednesday. Frances had 2 colleagues with her, one who handled criminal filings, one who specialized in financial fraud. They were thorough and unhurried, and they listened the way good doctors listen, without performing sympathy, just absorbing information and turning it into a plan. The plan had several parts. The first part involved my bank, which had already completed its internal review and confirmed the 3 unauthorized transfers. They had been prepared to wait for my direction, and I gave it. The joint account was closed. The transfers were flagged formally. A fraud report was filed. The second part involved a conversation between Frances and the State Adult Protective Services Office, which had a financial exploitation unit that, Frances explained, had both the authority and the motivation to move quickly in cases with this level of documentation. The third part involved me. Frances told me I needed to decide how far I wanted to take this. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Michael at 7 years old, falling off his bike on the driveway, coming inside with both palms scraped open, crying not because it hurt, but because he was embarrassed. I thought about how I had cleaned the wounds and told him that falling down was not the embarrassing part, that the embarrassing part would be if he didn't get back on the bike. I thought about the $41,000 and the smoothie and the recording and the word faster. "All the way," I said. A detective from the Financial Crimes Unit called me the following week. His name was Sergeant Holloway, and he was patient and methodical, and asked me to walk him through everything from the beginning, which I did. He told me the joint account transfers constituted unauthorized withdrawal, given that I had not consented to or been informed of any of them. He told me the situation with Todd, who it turned out had a prior complaint on file from another elderly client, was also being looked at separately. He told me to continue documenting and to behave normally with my son until they were ready to proceed. That was hard. I won't pretend otherwise. Michael called twice in the weeks after Thanksgiving. The first time was to follow up on the paperwork and to mention, casually, that Todd had refined the proposal, and it was really very straightforward, Nothing to be concerned about. And was Francis available to look at it this week? I told him I would check. The second time he called, his voice had a different quality, something tighter beneath the ease. And he mentioned that he and Renata had been having some financial stress, nothing serious, just the business going through a transition, and that I had always been so generous and understanding. And he knew this was a lot to ask, but was there any chance we could revisit the arrangement they'd discussed? I said I would need everything in writing sent to Francis first. He agreed. And then, 3 days later, Francis received a document from Todd's office that would have, if signed, granted Michael durable power of attorney over my financial and medical decisions, transferred my home into a trust with Michael as trustee, and included a clause buried on page 9 of 14, written in language that was technically plain but contextually opaque, that would have made it nearly impossible for me to revoke those arrangements without Michael's consent. Frances called me after she read it. "Carol," she said, "I want you to understand what this document would have meant." I understood. If I had been less careful, less stubborn, less willing to sit with a week of grief and then act anyway, if I had been the woman my son apparently thought I was, trusting and tired and grateful for the attention, I would have signed it. I might have signed it at Thanksgiving, before the smoothie, before the walk, if he had simply asked. I had loved him so completely for so long that the ask itself might have been enough. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the theft, not the document, not even the smoothie I hadn't drunk. It was the understanding that he had built his plan on what he knew about how much I loved him. Sergeant Holloway called on a Thursday morning in early December to tell me that charges had been filed. I was standing at my kitchen window, watching the bird feeder I had put up in October, a chickadee going back and forth with a single-mindedness I had always admired, and I heard the words and felt a quiet that I hadn't felt in months. Michael called that afternoon, and for the first time in our entire lives, I let it go to voicemail. Patricia drove up that weekend, and we sat on the back porch in the cold with blankets and hot tea, real tea I had made myself, and I told her everything from the beginning, including the parts I had been carrying alone, and she listened without interrupting the way her father used to listen, with his whole body, like what you were saying was the only thing in the room. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad would be proud of you." I thought about that. I thought about Dennis standing in this backyard with a can of beer on a summer evening, teaching Michael to throw a baseball, teaching Patricia to identify constellations by lying in the grass and pointing up at the sky. I thought about who that man was and who I had tried to be in the years since he was gone. "I don't know if proud is the right word," I said. "What would you call it?" I thought for a moment. "Clear," I said. He would say I finally got clear. The legal process is not fast, and it is not clean, and I will not pretend that there is anything like resolution in the ordinary sense of the word. Michael retained an attorney. Renata's family got involved. There were accusations made about my mental state, not formally, not in any document that would hold up to examination, but in conversations Patricia heard about from mutual family members, the suggestion that I had been confused, that I had misconstrued innocent financial planning, that grief had made me suspicious of the people who loved me most. I answered every one of those suggestions the same way, with documentation, the bank records, the notebook with 63 entries, the recording, the document from Todd's office, the statement from Sergeant Holloway, the testimony of Frances, who had been doing this work for 22 years and had never once been made to feel that her client's clarity was in question. I sold the house in February and moved to a smaller place 15 minutes from Patricia, not because I was afraid, and not because I was defeated, but because I had lived in that house for 22 years, and I had spent the last 6 months of those years watching it become a place where I had to be careful, and I did not want to be careful in my own home anymore. I wanted to drink tea in the morning without thinking about it. I wanted to sit at a kitchen table, without remembering what had been spread across it. The new place has a porch I can see the street from, and a garden bed the previous owners had let go, and a neighborhood where 3 other women I now know walk their dogs in the morning, and we have coffee sometimes on Thursdays. Patricia is close enough that she comes for dinner without making a production of it, just shows up with takeout and her laptop, and we eat on the couch and watch whatever she's been meaning to watch, and it is easy, the way the best things are easy. I think about Michael sometimes. I won't pretend that I don't, and I won't pretend that it doesn't hurt, because grief is not rational, and love is not conditional, and the arithmetic of betrayal does not balance, no matter how many times you run the numbers. I think about the boy on the bike, and the man at the stove, and the voice on the recording saying faster, and I hold all 3 of those things at the same time, because that is the truth of it. They are all the same person. But I also think about Frances sitting across from me in her office saying, "Carol, I want you to know what your options actually are." I think about Patricia's hand on mine at the kitchen table. I think about the chickadee at the bird feeder, going back and forth with such absolute focus, taking exactly what it needed and not one thing more. I think about the morning I almost lost everything, and how it began quietly, with someone smiling at me across a kitchen counter. And I think about how I looked at the glass, and I paused. That pause is the whole story, really. Every good thing that came after it came from that one moment of deciding to pay attention instead of deciding to believe. It wasn't suspicion, exactly. It wasn't fear. It was the thing I had spent 31 years building, one patient at a time, in a cardiac unit where the details that seemed small were almost always the ones that mattered most. I still do water aerobics on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I still cook on Sundays. Enough for the week, the way I always have. I still have the ceramic pilgrims in the hall closet, and I brought them out again this year and set them on the table and looked at them for a long time. And then I called Patricia and told her to come for Thanksgiving, and she brought the pecan pie, and we ate at a table that was just ours. And it was enough. It was more than enough.